The rope stretched taut against the cliff edge, its fibers already showing wear from the morning's work. Desmond Doss tested it one more time, pulling hard enough to feel the anchor point strain against the tree root they'd wrapped it around. Below, the voices of wounded men echoed up from the aid station 60 feet down. But above, on the plateau of Hacksaw Ridge, silence had fallen like a heavy blanket over the April rain. Company K of the 77th Infantry Division had been holding this position for 3 days, clinging to the rocky outcrop that jutted from Okinawa's southern landscape like a broken tooth. The Japanese had turned the ridge into a fortress of caves and hidden positions, each one commanding perfect fields of fire across the muddy approaches. What intelligence had called light resistance had become a grinding nightmare of mortar rounds and machine gun fire that swept the plateau clean of anything that moved. Sergeant Morrison crouched beside the rope, his rifle propped against a shattered tree stump. His hands shook slightly as he lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the exhaustion carved into his face. 3 stretcher-bearers huddled nearby, their canvas litters stacked and ready, but nobody wanted to be the first to test the open ground where 11 wounded men still lay scattered among the shell craters. "We got orders to pull back in 20 minutes, Morrison said, not looking at Doss. "Leave what we can't carry." Doss knelt beside his medical bag, checking the contents for what felt like the 100th time. 3 morphine syrettes, a handful of bandages, 2 tourniquets. The broken stretcher from the morning's failed rescue attempt lay in pieces nearby, its canvas torn and wooden poles snapped by shrapnel. He'd been staring at those pieces for an hour, seeing something the others couldn't. "Those men up there aren't equipment, Sergeant." Morrison's jaw tightened. He'd tried twice to press the standard-issue Colt 1911 into Doss's hands, and twice the medic had quietly refused. The other men watched this exchange with a mixture of bewilderment and desperate hope. They'd seen what Doss could do with nothing but determination and that medical bag, but the plateau above was different. It was a killing field where movement meant death. Private Jenkins, barely 19 and still carrying mud from his hometown in Georgia on his boots, spoke up from behind a boulder. "Doc, you can't drag them all back by yourself. Not across that." The rain intensified, turning the cliff face slick and making the rope glisten like a wet snake. Doss ran his fingers along the fibers, feeling where the weight of 3 evacuations had already begun to fray the weave. Each trip down had carried a wounded soldier to safety, but the rope was telling a story of gradual failure, strand by strand. From somewhere above came the distant crack of a rifle, then silence again. The Japanese were still up there, still watching, still waiting. They seemed to understand what was happening at the rope line, that one unarmed American kept venturing onto their killing ground and somehow making it back alive. "I need that stretcher canvas," Doss said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Morrison followed his gaze to the ruined equipment. "It's torn to hell, Doc. Poles are snapped clean through. Canvas can still hold a man if you use it right. Poles might be shorter now, but they're still wood." The sergeant crushed his cigarette against the wet rock. In 20 minutes, orders were orders. The company would fall back to regroup, leaving behind everything they couldn't carry and retreat. But as he watched Doss begin salvaging pieces from the broken stretcher, Morrison felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that some men fight with rifles, and others fight with rope and canvas, and the stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind. Jenkins crawled closer, his young face pale with a mixture of fear and awe. "Doc, what are you thinking?" Doss had begun working the torn canvas into a crude harness, testing the strength of the rope handles, measuring the give and take of fabric that had already been through one disaster. "I'm thinking those men up there are calling for a medic, and I'm the only one who doesn't need a weapon to answer." The words hung in the rain-soaked air, simple and impossible at the same time. Morrison checked his watch again. 18 minutes until the pullback order became final. 18 minutes to decide whether to follow regulations or follow one stubborn medic back into a place that had already swallowed too many good men. From the aid station below, a doctor's voice drifted up through the rain. "How many more coming down?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew if the rope would hold, if the canvas would tear, or if Desmond Doss would finally meet his match on the rain-slick plateau where Japanese gunners had already zeroed in on every yard of open ground. But as he finished knotting the improvised harness and looked up toward the ridge, Doss whispered something that might have been a prayer, or might have been a promise. Just one more. Just one more. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The first trip across the plateau taught Doss that courage and stupidity looked identical from the outside. He crawled 50 yards through mud that smelled of cordite and worse things, the salvaged canvas harness strapped across his chest like armor that would stop nothing. Every few yards he pressed himself flat and listened, for breathing, for Japanese voices, for the telltale click of a rifle bolt that meant someone had him in their sights. Private Coleman lay in a shell crater 30 yards from the cliff edge, conscious but losing blood from shrapnel wounds in both legs. When Doss slithered into the crater beside him, Coleman's eyes went wide with disbelief. "Doc, you're supposed to be down there with the others." "So are you," Doss replied, already working to apply a tourniquet with strips torn from the stretcher canvas. "But here we are." The journey back proved why the stretcher bearers had refused to venture onto the plateau. Japanese fire erupted the moment they began moving, bullets snapping through the air with the angry buzz of deadly insects. Doss had rigged the canvas harness under Coleman's arms and around his own chest, distributing the wounded man's weight as he dragged him inch by agonizing inch across the broken ground. By the time they reached the cliff edge, both men were covered in mud and shaking with exhaustion. The rope held Coleman's weight as Doss lowered him down to the aid station, but more fibers had frayed during the descent. The doctor below called up through the rain, "How many more, son?" 10, Doss called back, not mentioning that the rope probably wouldn't survive 5 more trips. Sergeant Morrison was waiting when Doss hauled himself back from the edge, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Orders came through. "We're pulling back in 15 minutes. "Then you'd better start pulling," Doss said, checking his medical supplies. 2 morphine syrettes left, half the bandages gone, and 10 wounded men still scattered across a plateau, swept by enemy fire. Jenkins approached hesitantly, carrying something wrapped in his poncho. "Doc, I pulled this from the supply dump before they started packing up." He unwrapped a field dressing and a small bottle of iodine. "Figured you might need it." The gesture hit Doss harder than he expected. For weeks, some of the men had treated him with barely concealed resentment. The medic who wouldn't carry a rifle, who knelt for prayers while others cleaned weapons, who insisted on Sabbath observance even in combat zones. But here was Jenkins, 19 years old and terrified, sharing his medical supplies with a man about to crawl back into hell. "Much obliged, Private." The second rescue nearly broke him. Corporal Martinez had crawled behind a fallen tree trunk, but Japanese snipers had the position bracketed. Getting to him required crossing 20 yards of open ground where 3 machine gun nests could converge their fire. Doss used the broken stretcher poles as probes, testing for tripwires and mines, then improvised a pulley system with the canvas rope looped around the tree trunk. He hauled Martinez back, foot by foot. Both men pressed flat against the mud, while bullets chewed bark from the fallen tree. The corporal had taken shrapnel in his chest and was struggling to breathe. Doss wrapped him in the remaining canvas and rigged a sling that kept the wounded man's chest elevated during the descent down the cliff face. When he climbed back up the rope for the 3rd time, his hands were raw with rope burns, and his shoulders ached from the makeshift harness. Morrison and the remaining men were gone, pulled back according to orders, leaving behind only the essential equipment and one stubborn medic who refused to count 10 wounded men as acceptable losses. The rain had intensified, turning the plateau into a slick nightmare of mud and standing water. Japanese voices carried across the broken ground, closer now, more confident. They were beginning to probe forward, testing the American withdrawal, unaware that one unarmed soldier remained behind with nothing but rope, torn canvas, and an unshakable conviction that every life was worth the risk. Doss knelt beside the fraying rope and checked his remaining supplies. One morphine syringe, 3 bandages, and whatever he could salvage from the broken stretcher. 8 wounded men still lay scattered across the killing field, their voices growing weaker with each passing hour. The rope showed dangerous wear, individual fibers snapping under stress, but it had to hold. Everything depended on that single line between the plateau of death and the aid station where hands waited to catch whatever mercy he could lower from above. From somewhere in the darkness, a voice called out, "Medic! Medic, over here!" Doss tested the rope one more time, whispered a prayer that might have been for strength or forgiveness, and began crawling back toward the sound of a man who needed him more than he needed safety. The voices from below had stopped calling up for updates. Down in the aid station, Dr. Patterson worked by lantern light on the men Doss had already sent down, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned not to think too much about the bodies under his care. 3 soldiers rescued, 8 still up there, and 1 medic who should have followed orders and pulled back with his unit. Patterson paused between patients to listen for sounds from above, the scrape of boots on rock, the whisper of rope against stone, anything to indicate that Doss was still alive up there. The rope line had gone slack twice in the past hour, and both times Patterson's stomach had dropped, thinking the worst. Both times the line had grown taut again as another wounded man began the slow descent through darkness. "How's he doing it?" asked Corporal Williams, one of the stretcher-bearers who'd refused to make the trip up. One man, no weapon, crossing ground that chewed up a whole squad this morning. Patterson didn't answer, partly because he was busy suturing shrapnel wounds, but mostly because he didn't have an answer. In 3 wars, he'd seen heroes and cowards, men who froze under fire, and men who seemed immune to fear. But he'd never seen anything like the steady stream of wounded men being lowered from a plateau that everyone else had written off as lost ground. Up on the ridge, Doss had discovered that the broken stretcher poles could serve purposes he'd never learned in any medical training. Private Thompson lay pinned behind a coral outcrop, conscious but unable to move with broken ribs that made every breath agony. Japanese fire had the position zeroed, but Doss used the splintered wood to test angles and create a crude leverage system that let him shift Thompson's position without exposing either man to direct fire. The improvised chest brace he fashioned from wooden poles and canvas strips wasn't in any field manual, but it kept Thompson's ribs stable during the agonizing crawl back to the cliff edge. Every yard revealed new ways that broken equipment could save lives. Torn canvas became bandages, rope handles became tourniquets, shattered wood became splints and levers, and tools for problems no training had anticipated. By the 4th rescue, Doss was running on determination, and whatever strength came from whispered fragments of Bible verses. His hands bled through makeshift gloves torn from his uniform sleeves. The harness had worn grooves into his shoulders that would leave scars for the rest of his life. Dehydration made his head swim, but the voices calling medic from the darkness drove him forward like a chain he couldn't break. The rope was failing. Individual strands snapped with small popping sounds that seemed loud as gunshots in the rain-soaked night. Doss tested each section before trusting it with a man's weight, feeling for weak spots, distributing stress across different anchor points. The tree root they'd originally used had started to pull loose from the wet soil, forcing him to rig backup lines using pieces of the shattered stretcher and whatever equipment the retreating squad had left behind. Private First Class Rodriguez was the hardest rescue yet. He'd crawled into a crater at the far edge of the plateau, almost in the Japanese lines, delirious with blood loss and calling for his mother in Spanish. Getting to him required crossing open ground swept by at least 2 machine gun positions, with enemy voices growing closer as infiltrators began probing the abandoned American positions. Doss wrapped the torn canvas around his torso like makeshift armor, knowing it would stop nothing, but hoping it might confuse enemy shooters in the darkness. The run across open ground felt like an eternity. Muzzle flashes lighting the night like deadly fireflies, bullets cracking past his head with sounds like breaking branches. He found Rodriguez unconscious in a crater, half filled with rainwater, his uniform soaked with blood and mud. The tourniquet took precious minutes to apply properly in the dark, working by touch, while Japanese voices called to each other less than 50 yards away. Getting Rodriguez back to the cliff required 2 separate trips, first dragging him to intermediate cover, then making a final desperate sprint with the wounded man wrapped in canvas and rope. The descent nearly killed them both. Halfway down the cliff face, the main rope began to part, individual strands snapping under the combined weight. Doss had to transfer Rodriguez to a backup line rigged from stretcher handles and torn canvas, lowering him the final 30 feet with equipment that should never have held, but somehow did. When Doss hauled himself back up to the plateau, he found 4 wounded men still scattered across the killing field. The rope showed dangerous wear. The canvas was more holes than fabric, and Japanese infiltrators were definitely moving closer. But from somewhere in the darkness came another voice. "Medic, over here, please. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The last 2 men lay together in a crater closest to the Japanese lines, their whispered voices barely audible above the rain that had turned the plateau into a swamp of mud and misery. Private Patterson, no relation to the doctor below, had taken shrapnel in both legs, while Sergeant Cruz fought to stay conscious with a head wound that had left him confused about where he was and why the night sky kept flashing with distant gunfire. Doss studied the approach for long minutes, counting muzzle flashes, timing the intervals between Japanese patrol calls. The enemy had definitely moved forward into the positions his company had abandoned, and they were close enough now that he could hear individual voices, the clink of equipment, the soft splash of boots in standing water. The rope was nearly finished. 20 feet from the anchor point, it had frayed down to perhaps a quarter of its original strength. The canvas harness was more improvisation than equipment now, strips and patches held together by knots and stubborn determination. But it had to work 2 more times. Everything came down to those final trips across ground that had already tried to kill him 6 times tonight. Getting to Patterson and Cruz required crossing 40 yards of open terrain under the direct observation of at least 3 Japanese positions. Doss gathered the last usable pieces of the broken stretcher, wrapped the torn canvas around his chest, and began the longest crawl of his life. Every few yards, he pressed himself flat and waited, for the muzzle flash that would end everything, for the shout that meant he'd been spotted, for the steady breathing that would tell him he'd somehow made it another step closer. The crater was deeper than it looked, carved by a mortar round that had barely missed the 2 wounded men. Patterson was conscious but couldn't walk. His left leg bent at an angle that made Doss's stomach clench. Cruz kept asking for water and calling for someone named Maria, his eyes unfocused, blood seeping through a field dressing that someone had applied hours earlier. "Doc," Cruz whispered, when he recognized the medic's outline against the dark sky. "Thought everyone left." "Not everyone," Doss replied, already working to assess their injuries by touch. Patterson's legs needed splints and elevation. Cruz required constant monitoring for signs of worsening head trauma. Neither man could survive the crawl back to the cliff edge without help, and Doss quickly realized he couldn't drag both at once across that killing field. He made the decision that would haunt his dreams for decades. Patterson first, because his injuries were more immediately life-threatening. Cruz would have to wait alone in the crater while Doss made the round trip. If the rope held, if the Japanese didn't advance, if a dozen variables broke in their favor instead of against them. The journey back with Patterson tested every knot and improvisation Doss had learned that night. The splints fashioned from stretcher poles kept the wounded man's legs stable, but they also made him heavier and harder to maneuver. Twice, Japanese fire erupted around them, forcing both men to press flat against the mud, while bullets churned the ground inches from their heads. The harness dug into Doss's shoulders until he could feel warm blood soaking through his uniform, but the torn canvas held, and they reached the cliff edge alive. Lowering Patterson down the rope required using the last backup line in tandem with the main rope, distributing weight across multiple anchor points to keep the fraying fibers from parting completely. Halfway down, Patterson lost consciousness from blood loss, becoming dead weight that swung sickeningly against the cliff face. But the knots held, the canvas supported his weight, and hands reached up from the aid station to guide him to safety. When Doss climbed back up for the final rescue, he found crews trying to crawl toward the American lines, confused and disoriented, leaving a trail of blood across the broken ground. Japanese voices were definitely closer now, close enough that Doss could hear individual words, the soft conversation of men who thought they were advancing into abandoned positions. Getting crews back to the cliff required a technique Doss had never learned and hoped never to use again. He wrapped the delirious sergeant in the bloodied canvas like a bundle, then used the rope to maintain connection while they moved. Cruz was semi-conscious, sometimes helping, sometimes fighting, always talking to people who weren't there about places Doss had never seen. The final descent nearly killed them both. The main rope parted completely 15 feet from the bottom, leaving them swinging on backup lines that shouldn't have supported a single man's weight. Doss had to transfer Cruz to a line rigged from stretcher canvas and wooden poles, lowering him the final distance with equipment held together by knots, prayers, and physics that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. When his feet finally touched solid ground at the aid station, Doss collapsed against a supply crate and looked up at the cliff edge 60 feet above. The torn rope hung in shreds, stirring in the rain-heavy wind. The plateau was silent now except for Japanese voices and the steady whisper of water running across stone. 11 wounded men had gone down that rope system. 11 men who would have died on the ridge if one unarmed medic hadn't decided that orders and regulations mattered less than the voices calling medic from the darkness. Dr. Patterson approached with a cup of coffee and a quiet question. "Son, how many times did you go up there?" Doss looked at his hands, raw with rope burns, bloody from crawling across coral and rock, trembling with exhaustion that went deeper than muscle and bone. "I don't know, Doc. I stopped counting after just one more." "Do." The official after-action report would record that Private First Class Desmond T. Doss, Medical Detachment, 307th Infantry, 77th Infantry Division, single-handedly evacuated wounded personnel from Hacksaw Ridge under heavy enemy fire, demonstrating conspicuous gallantry and extraordinary heroism. The language was clean, official, sanitized for citations and commendations that would follow him for the rest of his life. What the report wouldn't mention was the moment halfway through the night when Doss had pressed himself flat in a shell crater and seriously considered staying there until dawn, until rescue, until someone else took responsibility for the voices calling from the darkness. The moment when his faith cracked just enough to let in the thought that maybe God was asking too much, that maybe one man with torn canvas and fraying rope couldn't carry the weight of all that suffering. It happened during the 6th rescue, when he'd crawled out to reach Corporal Henderson and found the man already dead, killed by a sniper's bullet sometime in the previous hour. Doss had lain beside the cooling body, listening to Henderson's blood drip into the standing water at the bottom of the crater, and felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion or fear. He'd been talking to Henderson for hours, calling out encouragement during the long intervals between rescues. "Hold on, Corporal, coming back for you, just hold on." But Henderson had stopped answering 20 minutes earlier, and Doss had been too focused on other wounded men to understand what that silence meant. The realization that he'd failed someone, that his careful rotation of rescues had cost a man his life, hit him like a physical blow. For 5 minutes, he'd lain in that crater beside Henderson's body and felt his faith drain away, like water through cracked stone. The prayers that had sustained him through 8 rescues turned to ash in his mouth. The Bible verses that usually brought strength felt like empty words rattling around in his skull. He'd closed his eyes and seriously considered crawling back to the cliff edge alone, telling Dr. Patterson that the others were beyond help, that he'd done all anyone could expect. But then another voice had called out, weak, desperate, somebody else who needed him more than he needed the comfort of giving up. And somehow, in the space between Henderson's silence and that new cry for help, Doss had found something deeper than faith, something more stubborn than courage. Not the certainty that God would protect him, but the knowledge that he couldn't live with himself if he stopped trying. The revelation that sustained him through the final rescues wasn't mystical or inspirational. It was grimly practical. He was the only medic left on the ridge. These men would die without him, and dying slowly from wounds was worse than dying quickly from bullets. Someone had to keep going back up that rope, and there was nobody else to do it. Dr. Patterson had noticed the change when Doss brought down the 7th man. The quiet confidence was gone, replaced by something harder and more brittle. The medic's hands shook as he rigged the rope systems, and he'd stopped whispering prayers between rescues. Instead, he worked with the mechanical precision of a man who'd moved beyond faith into something raw and more desperate. "Son," Patterson had said quietly, checking the wounded man Doss had just lowered. "You don't have to keep going up there." "Yes, I do," Doss had replied, not looking at the doctor. "4 more voices up there. Can't leave them." What he didn't say was that he'd stopped believing God would protect him. What he didn't say was that every trip up the rope felt like suicide, and he kept making them anyway because the alternative, listening to wounded men die slowly in the darkness, was worse than the fear. What he didn't say was that Henderson's death had taught him the difference between faith and responsibility, and that sometimes responsibility had to be enough. The citation would mention extraordinary heroism, but it wouldn't capture the moment when heroism ran out and something else took over. Something that had less to do with courage than with the stubborn refusal to let other people's pain be wasted. Henderson was dead, but the others didn't have to be. The rope was fraying, but it could hold a few more trips. His hands were raw, but they could still tie knots. When the final wounded man reached the aid station and Doss began his own descent from the ridge, he carried with him the knowledge that would shape the rest of his life. Faith might sustain you through the easy parts, but in the hardest moments, you keep going because someone has to, and there's nobody else around to do it. Years later, when people asked him about that night, he would talk about prayers and divine protection, about the strength that comes from serving others. He would never mention Henderson's body cooling in the crater, or the 5 minutes when his faith cracked wide enough to let in the darkness. He would never explain that the real weight he carried down from Hacksaw Ridge wasn't heroism or inspiration, but the knowledge that sometimes keeping faith means admitting when faith isn't enough. 3 weeks after Hacksaw Ridge, Doss sat in a rear area aid station on Okinawa, supposedly recovering from exhaustion and the infected rope burns that had left permanent scars on his hands and shoulders. The doctor said he needed rest, but rest meant silence, and silence meant remembering Henderson's face in the darkness, the weight of torn canvas, the sound the rope made when individual fibers snapped under pressure. A young correspondent from Stars and Stripes had tracked him down, eager to write about the medic who'd saved 11 men in a single night. The reporter had a list of questions about heroism and divine protection, about the power of faith under fire. He wanted quotes that would inspire folks back home, stories that would help sell war bonds and maintain morale. "Tell me about the moment you decided to go back up there," the correspondent said, pencil poised over a notebook. "What gave you the strength to keep climbing that rope?" Doss looked at his hands, at the rope scars that would never completely fade, at the slight tremor that had developed in his fingers since the night on the ridge. How could he explain that strength had nothing to do with it? That he'd kept going back up because stopping felt like a kind of death, and dying slowly from cowardice seemed worse than dying quickly from Japanese bullets? "I just tried to help," he said finally. "When someone calls for a medic, you go. That's what medics do." The reporter waited for more, for inspiration, for testimony, for the kind of clean narrative that would translate well to newspaper columns and radio broadcasts. But Doss had nothing else to offer. The truth was too complicated, too heavy with doubt and failure, and the knowledge that heroism looked different from the inside than it did in official reports. 6 months later, in a hospital in Virginia, Doss received word that he'd been awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation mentioned conspicuous gallantry and extraordinary heroism, language that made the night on Hacksaw Ridge sound clean and purposeful. President Truman would present the medal in a White House ceremony that photographers would capture for posterity, creating images that would outlive everyone who'd been on the ridge that night. But alone in his hospital bed, Doss found himself thinking about the moment when faith wasn't enough, when he'd lain beside Henderson's cooling body and seriously considered giving up. The medal honored his actions, but it couldn't capture the weight of that choice, to keep going, not because he believed God would protect him, but because someone had to, and there was nobody else around to do it. Years later, in civilian life, the smell of wet rope would bring it all back. Rain on canvas, the sound of fraying fibers, Japanese voices in the darkness, and the steady drip of Henderson's blood into standing water. People would ask him about that night, wanting to hear about miracles and divine intervention. He would tell them what they needed to hear, about prayer and service, about the strength that comes from helping others. He would never mention the 5 minutes when his faith cracked, or the knowledge that sometimes keeping faith means admitting when faith isn't enough. He would never explain that the real miracle wasn't divine protection, but the stubborn human refusal to let suffering go unanswered when you're the only one in position to help. The legend would grow over decades. Books, films, testimony at churches and veterans' gatherings. Each retelling would smooth away the rough edges, the doubt and fear and moral complexity that made the night on Hacksaw Ridge feel more like drowning than flying. The legend was lighter than the memory, easier to carry, better suited for inspiration than education. But sometimes late at night, when rain drummed against his roof and the wind stirred the trees outside his window, Doss would remember the weight of torn canvas, the bite of rope against scarred palms, and the voices calling "medic" from darkness that seemed infinite. He would remember Henderson's silence and the moment when heroism ran out and something else took over, something harder to name but no less real. In those quiet moments, he understood the difference between the story people needed to hear and the weight he would carry for the rest of his life. The medal belonged to the legend, but the tremor in his hands belonged to him, along with the knowledge that courage wasn't the absence of fear or doubt, but the decision to keep moving forward when both faith and fear told you to stop. The rope had held just long enough. The canvas had torn, but never completely failed. 11 men had reached the aid station alive because one medic decided that responsibility mattered more than safety, and that sometimes responsibility had to be enough when everything else ran out. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.